Hi, I'm Arthur, and in 40k, the idea of gods and monsters is one of the largest drawing factors of people to the setting. I don't think it's hyperbolic for me to say that a lot of 40k, although based in pre-existing tropes, has some of the best examples of sci-fi and fantasy monsters in most fiction. I tend to consider 40k more future fantasy as a story than that of science fiction, so it's kind of fitting that we discuss the topic that we're going to be talking about today. A lot of factions in the setting have a weird, unique tinge to them that you don't really see in other settings. One of the ones people tend to like a lot is the Necrons, which in essence are just necro-automatons. Don't worry, it took me a bit to figure that one out too. The Necron are an ancient race of sentient robotic organisms that, due to them selling their souls literally and figuratively for power to ancient star gods, ended up with mostly immortal living metal bodies. Now, I'm not going to cover the War in Heaven as much as I probably should, or the Necron as much as I want to here, but in general, you should know that the Robots won the war, the star gods that gave them the power betrayed them, they took that personally, and now they use the star gods as Duracell batteries for most of their contraptions. You play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Though reductive, we will cover them a bit more later, these topics that is. But this is a video about the star gods, the Catan, which, fun fact, until I made this YouTube channel and had an entire audience of people to yell at me for saying words wrong, I thought it was actually pronounced Citan, which, okay, cool, it might be, I take it back, I'm gonna say it right from now on. But yeah, the Catan are such a fun concept that I don't feel people extrapolate on them as much as they probably should or could. They are an inversion of what the Chaos Gods are, where the Chaos Gods exist specifically because psychic emanations from people created them. The Catan actually exist as living representations of physical and psychological constants in the universe. You don't follow the difference here? So to break it down, you can't get rid of corn without having to get rid of the things that produce corn. Like, if you want to get rid of every single person who feels rage or murderous intent while also being psychically charged, then corn will disappear. You don't have to get rid of every single person. Not the other way around. People existed long before the Chaos Gods did. But for the Catan, they represent basic concepts. So say the Catan of fire. You can get rid of every single fire in the universe and snuff them out all at once, but the fire Catan will probably still be around, as the concept of fire is still around, and thus fire can still be created even if there is nothing of it in the universe in that moment. But if you get rid of the fire Catan, then fire as a constant or an idea in the universe is actually removed from existence. In theory. We don't have many ideas as to what happens if you fully remove a Catan from existence, because the one time we did, it didn't really remove itself as it started to manifest in other ways than just being a Catan or a Catan shard, but we'll cover what I mean by that a little bit later when we get to the flare. So does all that make sense? Basically, each Catan represents a basic concept that exists because of them. They are the reason some things happen, and because of that, they can be a bit esoteric. So some Catan are easy to understand, others aren't, and others tend to overlap in concepts. But before we get off into naming the Catan we all know and love, I want to cover just a few basic ideas so that you kind of have a key as to what we're talking about. So what complicates this entire process is, for one, Catan were broken down into shards. These shards exist because the Catan originally were basically just amorphous blobs of magical whatever that were put into physical bodies by the Necron tier, the pre-race of the Necron. They were sealed into a similar living metal body that's kind of similar to the necrodermis that eventually became what the Necrons use as bodies. Meaning these shards are basically supercharged mega metal prison pieces of what they once were. Now, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that because they're referred to as shards and more gem-like than they were metals, but I digress. The shards make them manageable. By dividing their power up between said shards, it makes them easier to be harnessed and controlled, a lot more than just a full Catan would be. To complicate things more, when shards of Catan come into contact with each other, they actually merge, and it doesn't actually have to be shards of the same Catan to kind of form together like a puzzle piece. Sometimes it can just be Catan shards from other Catan that mix together, and if they are of equal power and no single consciousness takes over, these shards actually can yield something that is kind of in the category of absolutely fucking no good 0 out of 10 tomato brick bad, which is a transcendent Catan, which are actually hard to deal with. They are so powerful that the Necron had to invent a special type of containment prison for them in order to keep them stable and, keep them from attacking other Necron. These are the Tesseract vaults. Transcendent Catan are actually multiple times stronger than Catan shards of the same size of the one that made the Transcendent Catan. It's more of a multiplicative effect rather than an additive effect when you have multiple shards of the same power. There are several instances of shards being stronger than other shards for reasons neither here nor there, and we'll cover a kind of pseudo ranking of who we know the most about and who would technically be the strongest of what we know. But once again, complicating things further is that Catan can also occupy similar concepts as other Catan, as long as there is slightly a different tinge to them. So we do have to break out the metaphysics for some of these a little bit. Like, the Void Dragon is the Catan of Oblivion, and the Nightbringer is the Catan of Death and Darkness, which, from a reductionist point of view, is probably the same thing, but what do I know? I'm not going to argue metaphysics on a YouTube channel where there are at least 3 sound bites of me loudly proclaiming about how much I love Space Marine man-ass. $5 to any of you who can actually find all 3 of those and send them to me on my Discord server. But yeah, that's kinda all you need to know about this video before I get into it. But before I do break down the Catan we know about, I just want to state, yeah, this is going to be a bit of a longer video. I want to try experimenting with format to see what serves me best. A lot of you have been kind of saying that you tend to vibe out to my videos and just listen to me talking, so I kind of want to try and experiment with longer videos and see what you guys think about them. So yeah, let's start talking about the Catan shards, with the 3 most people tend to know about, starting this off. So, the Nightbringer, also known as Azagorod, is probably the most well-known of the Catan shards, as it's kind of the most dangerous of the bunch in general terms, due to the fact that it's more common than the actual most dangerous one, but we'll get into that one later. I suppose if I were to say which were the most dangerous, it'd probably be the Void Dragon or the Outsider, but again, those aren't too common. So, the Nightbringer is often represented by the stereotypical boo haunted house Grim Reaper shtick. They tend to manifest as just a generic psychopomp, and we'll get into why, but the Nightbringer, as its name implies, is the Catan of death dying in the act of killing. Basically, if it has to do with the cessation of life, the Nightbringer is the culmination of that idea. Its existence is singularly the reason why psychopomps as a whole exist, and psychopomps are just a mainstay constant in the universe at large. It is an incredibly powerful creature, as the concept it governs is so universal to be almost ubiquitous with the idea of living itself, because if anything lives, it shall one day die, and thus the concept was birthed by the existence of this entity. The Nightbringer is the concept of anti-life. There are so many examples of Space Marines and other entities that feel quite literally no fear. It is impossible for them to do so, interacting with the Nightbringer, and it ends with them, for the first time in their entire existence, feeling what they were told they could never feel again: fear. As when Azagorod manifests, depending on the size of the shard, it literally causes the fear and imagery of death and killing to be put into the heads of everyone in a pretty decently large range. In the first book of the Uriel Ventress series, he ended up facing the Nightbringer, and I know a lot of people shit on the idea of a Space Marine beating the Nightbringer, but don't get it twisted. He did not beat the Nightbringer. He just sealed it away and was a little bit snappy about it. But even that short interaction where Uriel left kind of unscathed, it was maybe like 10 minutes. It still affects him all the way up to, I believe, book 4? Probably beyond that, but that's the book that I'm currently on, so, And that takes place a quite a few years after the first book, where he is still plagued with nightmares of wanton slaughter that he was forced to see because of his proximity to the Nightbringer. It's a very interesting idea, and one I really like. In D&D, the idea of meeting the Grim Reaper is usually kind of a blasé affair for unskilled GMs, but when people interact with the Nightbringer in any of the novels I've seen, it is, although not eldritch, it's very, very good horror. It reminds me so much of the scene from Chainsaw Man where the cast and crew go to hell for just like a few minutes and end up encountering a primordial devil representing the fear of the dark, where even if you don't fully understand what you're seeing, you can kind of tell it's not good and probably you shouldn't be there messing with it. Mephetron is the Catan of lies, deception, and just kind of being an asshole. Of the big three that everyone kind of knows about, which is the big three that have miniatures right now, the Deceiver is, for one, the weakest of the three, and for two, is actually considered to be a relatively weak Catan as a whole, even before they were broken into shards. See, unlike gods of other denominations that are powered by the belief of followers, like Nurgle may be the god of disease, but if he went up against the god of feathers and love that had more followers than him, he'd probably lose. My point here is that with the Catan, their powers as a whole are kind of static and based around the initial consumption of souls that they had, as well as the consumption of other Catan, but we will get into that a little bit later when we actually cover the Outsider. But outside of that, the strength of the Catan is actually kind of static to the concept that they govern over. So the Nightbringer governs the act of killing and the act of dying. So therefore, if you have a smaller shard of it, the Nightbringer is going to be really good at doing those two things, killing and making things die. So that kind of power makes it pretty difficult and pretty dangerous to control. Hell, Necron as a whole are nervous when they have to actually summon the Nightbringer. So with the Deceiver being based around a non-combative idea like deception, its combat abilities are a bit lackluster in comparison to other Catan. Does that mean you can actually fight it? No! It's still a star god, and it's going to huck meteors of antimatter at your goddamn face. Bro, have you not been listening to me? They are star gods. Just because it prefers to lie and trick people doesn't mean that it can't just casually rip reality in half on a whim. Catan are incredibly powerful at base, so regardless of if the Deceiver is weaker or the weakest Catan in the setting, it's like saying, oh, you only brought a small tank to a knife fight. But regardless, what makes Mephetron so significant? Well, it's significant as it was the one to trick the Necrontyr into slavery through the means of biotransference, which means that it plays a significant role in kind of the downfall of the whole universe, technically. If the Necrontyr never ascended, then the war in heaven would probably not have been won on the side of the Catan and the Necron. They probably would have had a significantly harder time. The old ones would probably still be around. Chaos probably would not exist to the capacity that does now. Weird shit, right? We always blame this guy, but it's actually probably this guy that's like the reason why a lot of shit went bad. So yeah, Mephetron, the Deceiver. TLDR, screw this guy. Magladroth is my favorite of the Catan. Period. This Catan is one of the closest to eldritch horror out of all of the Catan I've ever seen, and the Catan as a whole are pretty eldritch horror adjacent. So the closer you get to that paradox of I don't know what I'm seeing, but I'm scared, the more I'm interested. See, with the Nightbringer, it kind of represents this contemporary horror. This idea of death, dying, and horrors beyond your understanding being blasted in your mind at warp speed is pretty damn scary, but it is very understandable. But with the Void Dragon is the Catan of nothingness and oblivion. I know a lot of people use other words to describe it, but it's the best way to differentiate it between itself and the Nightbringer. But the idea of oblivion and ceaseless destruction is kind of the way they describe it. But whenever it's shown or interacted with, it's never really given the same impression as the other Catan, especially the Nightbringer. Basically, when someone interacts with this Catan, it's like someone walked into a room of fear where they do not understand any of the things they are seeing, but they are about to feel some kind of primal terror while unlocking some ancient knowledge they should not know. And I kind of like that. So the idea of it being the Catan of nothingness and oblivion has more to do with the idea of the absence of all thought, spirit, and life, the blackness that comes when you flatline and truly die. I think that's one of the reasons why the Void Dragon is one of the scariest and most hard to understand of the Catan, because I want you to try to imagine nothing right now. Close your eyes and then imagine a shoe. I want you to make sure that their shoe is in a black room. Then I want you to take away the laces, take away the tongue, take away the insole, take away the rubber of the grips, take away the fabric, and then as you're slowly taking away everything, keep stripping back the layers of fabric until there's nothing left but a black room. It's a meditation technique. I know it's a little bit of a weird way to get to a blank mindset, but whatever. But that blank blackness that you're seeing in your head, that's not nothing. We don't even have nothing to compare to, because the only reason why we can say we understand what nothing is because we need something to compare it to. So the Void Dragon represents that concept of absence, which is why the Void Dragon is so good at destroying things. And the reason why the Void Dragon has such an affinity for machines. Machines have no spirit. They are a blank emptiness that is controlled by the wills of other things, which is why it improves machines and can destroy machines on a whim. I think that's a very interesting concept, and to have its motivation more or less be the removal of all things and the idea of it being this kind of eldritch, insane monster is really cool. So because it has this affinity with machines, it has this inspirational effect on people who want to now learn more about machines. Thus why it was buried on Mars by the Emperor to stimulate the growth of the Martian Empire, so the Emperor could have a permanent manufactory set of worlds for his growing imperium. Check out my Great Lie of Mars video if you want to know more about what I'm talking about. It's pretty devious. But regardless, I love the Void Dragon. It's such a fun entity in the setting, and the largest shard of it still is on Mars to my understanding, with only smaller shards being used now. So the idea of the biggest shard ever being released to the public? Oh god, that's so cool and interesting. Okay, so with the big three out of the way, I'm gonna kinda do a bit of a lightning round for the last batch, as we have varying degrees of lore, but not nearly as much as the last three that we discussed. And I think a few of these I've already talked about, so aside from two of these that have a decent amount of lore, I'm just gonna kinda go through these and give you the basic idea without going too in depth with the theory crafting, or else we'd be here all day. I wanna make longer videos, I don't wanna make documentaries. Saranoga is kind of the sleeper hit of the Catan. Like, if you play 40k casually, you would totally be forgiven for not knowing anything about this one. Because honestly, I didn't know anything about the Outsider until relatively recently. They are one of the more interesting of the Catan, and note how I'm not saying Catan shard, as the Outsider was not turned into shards. It was actually dealt with in a bit more of an interesting way. Comically enough, I don't really have to go into detail about what happened. I just need to say the sentence, Kegarak was involved, and you will immediately go, oh yeah, that tracks. Basically, the Outsider was tricked by the Eldar laughing god Kegarak into consuming its brothers, and actually ate a few of the Catan, thus weakening the war effort as a whole for the Necron. It was driven insane by the power, the weirdness of eating a Catan, and so on, and thus fled into the void to do weird god shit like they usually do. Which it does, and thus it was never turned into shards. And also, thusly, it is likely one of the most powerful beings in the setting right now, which is weird to think about. I know we don't know much about it other than that, but due to its self-imposed exile and a few other prompts that I noticed when researching it, I like to think that the base concept the Outsider represents is loneliness. This idea of being alone and lashing out at others does make sense, and it is one of those Catan that, when you see it, it allegedly has a similar effect on you that the Nightbringer does, which is to say, not good in the slightest, usually insanity and so on. There's also a theory I read, I think on the wiki, that the Outsider is responsible, allegedly, for the Tyranids, which I don't like that theory. In my mind, it's not canon. which I can do as a 40k YouTuber. My perception is my reality. Eat my ass. Landagore is a Catan we don't know much about, and is one of the Catan we don't have shards of, because it was technically the only Catan we actually ended up killing to some degree, though only technically. So this kind of loops back to something I mentioned earlier, where I personally think that even if you kill a Catan, some part of their essence still stays around permanently in order to keep the balance of the concept they represent. You'll know the Flayer from his death being responsible for the creation of the Flayer curse, which is currently ravaging many Necron dynasties, which is why, in general, it's better not to kill a Catan. So to elaborate on my theory, if you kill, say, the Catan of Fire, which we will cover 2 possible ones for that kind of fit the description of a Catan of Fire, but if you kill it, its anchor on the concept it represents still exists. As you can't really get rid of fire without destroying the entire universe, it's kind of a necessity. So this weird metaphysical representation of the physical world counterpart concept that it exudes manifests in one way or another somewhere else. Thus, killing the Flayer caused the Flayer curse to keep the idea of the Flayer represented around, which is probably incorrect and a bunch of pseudo-intellectual garbage, but I mean, you've made it this far, so I mean, I could just throw whatever I wanted in here. So, yeah. Zarhalash is weird. It's only significant because it is the Catan shard that was used to power the Pharaoh's device, which I should remind you all, the Pharaoh's device is like unequivocally Necron in origin. I mentioned that a while back, and a few people in the comments were actually getting kind of mad saying that I wasn't, but no, in Belisarius' Call, the Great Work, it's actually revealed that the Pharaoh's device is a Necron creation, and what was powering it was the Catan shard, Zarhalash the Potentate. Not much else can be gleaned about it, other than the fact that Call tricked it into teleporting itself deep into Necron's occupied space, and it's probably not having a great time right now. Or probably just a battery right now. Nyadrazatha is one of the Catan I think are one of the best examples of representing just flat out fire, as it just wants to burn things. Other than that, we don't know much about it. It is responsible for the creation of the Dolmen gates, which, if you don't know, is one of the main reasons the Necron can travel the universe at a greater speed than faster than light. Necrons, see, they don't have psychers in the slightest in their species, also because, you know, they're robots. So warp travel isn't really an option for them. So they essentially have carved out a path in the webway like the Eldar, which is super useful. I'm like 90% certain that the burning one helped make this tech just so it could burn more shit even in the webway, but who am I to yuck someone's yum for being repetitive? I'm a 40k content creator. If I didn't make a video about the Space Marines at least once every 2 weeks, my channel would wither on the vine. Ygrania is more or less the last Catan shard we know a sizable amount about. Basically, as the title of The World Shaper would suggest, its main abilities focus around the manipulation of the environment and the control of planets. It's actually pretty damn powerful, as it can control the entire environment of a planet and even destroy it with a whim. It's alleged to be so good at doing so that it's likely the Catan based around the concept of the formation of planets themselves, or just some other kind of ecological concept that I'm just being too vague about. It was responsible for the rule and creation of the World Engine, a massive planetoid made of metal that was host to a Necron dynasty during the War of Heaven, and even after the betrayal of the Silent King and sharding of the World Shaper, it still existed on the World Engine as a whole. There was a lot of hijinks involved, but they would involve me basically just recounting an entire Ultramarine story, so I suggest just reading about it yourself, as there isn't much else to know other than it has a pretty badass physical description back when it was just a full-ass Catan, and it convinced a few other chapters of Space Marines to fight and destroy a certain Necron who'd actually gotten a hold of its original necrodermis skin to, I don't know, get godlike powers, which it did. The last shard we know about was actually more or less destroyed, or, well, as destroyed as a Catan shard can be. It was banished into the warp when Kato Sicarius threw a vortex grenade at it, which is honestly how we should deal with the majority of these problems, you know. To quote another YouTuber, the concept of perfect immortality kind of gets thrown out the window when the idea of throwing someone into the center of a fucking sun kind of comes up, so. Inferan, the Spiral Flame, Ayashudra, the Endless Swarm, and Ogdriata, the Arisen. We know very little about any of these, other than A, they exist, and B, that with Inferan, it was just used like a Pokemon to fight Tyranids once by Nemasuri Yardas. I'm not kidding. The names are all we have to go on, so piece together whatever you need to kind of make your peace with that. And that's everything. Or at least everything I could find on all the Catan and Catan shards that currently exist in the 40k universe. There could be more, and there's probably a few that I missed. The game has existed for over 30 years, so there's probably a few snippets that I haven't seen, and also probably going to be a few snippets happening in the near future. But regardless, I really enjoyed researching all of these, and in general, I think the Catan being used as sparingly as they are is a good thing. If you overuse the biggest bad in a setting, you will see people care less and less about them. See Abaddon the Despoiler for, my confirmation there. But what do you all think? Are the Catan cool? Do you want to see any of them specifically get a model, or any kind of Catan in general get a type of model? And what would that be? I have this kind of fascination with the idea of the Outsider coming back as like a Demon Primarch level model that just is one singular entity that's a centerpiece model and is just stupidly overpowered. But that's just me. Let me know in the comments, and also let me know what you think about the longer video formats. I want to try and give you guys more stuff you can enjoy, so I'm out here trying to make longer videos. It's a lot more satisfying to make than just 2 smaller videos a week, so I kind of enjoy it. But if you guys don't like it, I'll go back. Also, remember to like and subscribe. Special thanks to my channel members for supporting me, and if you want to support me as well as gain access to additional and early content, then become a channel member today. Thanks once again for watching. And before I go, I'm kind of proud of myself for not actually mispronouncing any of the words that are the names of these goddamn things. I actually practiced before reading any of these, so I still probably got them wrong, but whatever.